The paper in front of me does not look dangerous. It is thin, almost see-through, covered in shifting silver symbols that rearrange themselves into English the moment my eyes settle on them. But I know what it says. I have read it 3 times already, and each time the words feel heavier. Seed 3 border systems. For the sake of galactic stability. I look up from the table. The chamber around me is enormous, shaped like a shell, with rows of seats rising toward a ceiling that glows faintly blue. Every seat is filled with a different kind of face. Some have too many eyes. Some have none that I can see at all. A few are wrapped in robes that move on their own, like slow water. This is the Galactic Council, and I am sitting where I never expected to sit, wearing a jacket that does not quite fit, holding a treaty that was never meant to reach my hands. My name is Claire Whitfield. 3 days ago, I was the second assistant to Ambassador Henry Dawson, mostly responsible for scheduling and translation checks. Henry was supposed to be here. He was supposed to be the one facing this room, not me. But 2 nights before departure, he came down with something the medical staff still cannot explain, some virus that made his hands shake so badly he could not sign his own name. The council does not wait for anyone, so here I am. A tall being with skin like brushed metal, who introduced himself earlier as Speaker Van of the Tessic Compact, taps the table gently with one long finger. "Ambassador Whitfield," he says, "though I am not truly an ambassador, only standing in for one. You have had time to review the terms. We understand this is your first session. We are prepared to answer any questions you might have before you sign." I glance at the paper again. 3 systems, not empty ones. 2 of them have small colonies, families who moved there over the last 20 years to build something new. The 3rd is mostly mining operations, but there are people living there too, people who did not choose to be part of any treaty negotiation. "I have a question," I say. Van inclines his head, pleased. This is the part he expects, the part where I ask for concessions, for compensation, for a longer timeline. This is how it always goes, I am told. Everyone asks for something back. "Why do you need our systems?" I ask instead. A murmur moves through the chamber, quiet but noticeable, like wind passing through leaves. "Stability," Van says smoothly. Border tensions in that sector have increased. Removing a variable makes calculations easier for everyone. Removing a variable, I repeat. You mean removing people? The population will be relocated with full support, he says. This is not new to your species. Many worlds in this council have resettled populations for the greater good. I look down at the treaty one more time. I think about the mining families. I think about children who have never seen Earth, who call some cold rocky moon home because it is the only home they know. I think about Henry, sick in a medical bay 100 light-years away, who would probably tell me to find some clever middle ground, some way to buy time, some diplomatic trick to slow this down without causing a scene. I do not feel like buying time. "No," I say. The word comes out smaller than I expect, almost swallowed by the size of the room, but it lands like a stone dropped into still water. Van blinks, an odd motion where each eye closes independently. "I am sorry. Perhaps the language relay did not translate correctly. Could you repeat your response?" "No," I say again, clearer this time. "We are not signing this. We are not moving those families. We are not giving up those systems." The silence that follows is not empty. It is full, the way a held breath is full. I can feel it pressing against my ears. Somewhere above me, a delegate with 4 arms slowly lowers all of them at once, as if bracing for something. Another being, wrapped in that slow-moving robe, goes completely still, the fabric freezing mid-ripple. Van's mouth opens, then closes. When he speaks again, his voice has lost its earlier smoothness. "You are refusing to negotiate." "I am refusing your terms," I say. "That is different from refusing to talk. I am happy to talk. I am not happy to hand over 3 systems because a spreadsheet somewhere said it would make things tidier." "This is not how the process works," says a new voice, sharp and quick, from somewhere to my left. I turn to see a smaller delegate, blue-skinned, with a crest of feather-like growths along the top of her head. Her nameplate reads Counselor Aura Dresh, representing the Andrai Assembly. Every species that enters this chamber negotiates. You review, you counter, you find middle ground. This is the foundation of the council. I understand that is how it usually works, I say. But nobody explained that we have to accept unfair terms just because that is the tradition. It is not about fairness, Dresh says, leaning forward. It is about function. 200 species share this council. If everyone simply said no whenever they disagreed, nothing would ever be decided. Wars would return. Do you understand what you are risking? Her words are meant to frighten me, I think, and in a distant way they do. I am aware, sitting here, that I represent a species most of this room barely knows. We joined the wider galaxy only a decade ago. We do not have a fleet that could stand shoulder to shoulder with the Tessek Compact or the older powers. We are, in the eyes of most of this chamber, still new, still small, still uncertain of our place. But I did not come here to be uncertain. I understand the risk, I say, and I try to keep my voice steady, because inside my chest, my heart is beating so hard, I can feel it in my throat. I also understand that if we sign this today, there will be another treaty next year, asking for something else, and another the year after that. There is always a next request when the first one works. Van's metallic skin seems to shift color slightly, something like a frown passing across features that are not quite a face. You speak as though every request from this council is designed to weaken you. I don't think that, I say honestly. I think most of the people in this room believe they are doing something reasonable. I think you have done this so many times, with so many species, that it has become normal to ask. But normal for you does not mean right for us. A ripple of low sound moves through the chamber, something between a gasp and a whisper, dozens of species reacting in dozens of different ways. Somewhere behind me, I hear what might be laughter, sharp and disbelieving. Somewhere else, silence deepens further, heavier than before. Counselor Dresh folds her hands together, feathers along her crest lying flat, a gesture I will later learn means she is trying to stay calm. Ambassador Whitfield, I want to make certain you understand the position you are placing your species in. This council does not take refusal lightly. There are systems for managing disagreement, but outright rejection, without a counteroffer, without any attempt at compromise, is almost unheard of. Almost, I say, so it has happened before. Rarely, and rarely well, she answers. I feel the pressure of that sentence settle over the room. I think about turning back, about softening my words, offering some small compromise just to ease the tension crawling across every face turned toward me. It would be easy. I could say we need more time. I could say we will discuss it with our government and return next cycle. That would satisfy the room. That would let everyone breathe again. Instead, I fold my hands on the table, the same way Dresh just did, though I do not know if that will translate as calm to her or as something else entirely. I am not here to manage your expectations, I say. I am here to represent people who did not agree to be traded away for someone else's convenience. My answer stands, no. For a long moment, nobody speaks. The chamber, built to hold the voices of 200 worlds, holds nothing but silence. Then Van rises slowly from his seat, tall and metallic, and clearly unsettled in a way his species rarely shows. This session is recessed, he announces, his voice carrying an edge I have not heard from him before. We will reconvene once the human representative has had time to reconsider her position. I don't need time, I say, but take whatever time you need. I do not know, as I say this, whether I have just done something brave or something that will follow my species for generations. I only know that when I imagine signing that treaty, imagine those families being told to pack their lives into crates because a room full of strangers decided their home was inconvenient, I cannot make my hand move toward the pen. As the delegates begin to file out, murmuring to each other in languages my translator struggles to keep up with, I stay seated, alone at the human station, staring at the treaty that remains unsigned in front of me. Somewhere far above, through a window I had not noticed until now, I can see stars scattered across black space, more of them than I have ordinarily seen from Earth. Somewhere among them is my planet, small and blue and utterly unaware that its future might have just shifted because one tired, frightened woman said a single word she was never trained to say. Number. I sit with that word a while longer, turning it over, half expecting it to feel like a mistake. It does not. It feels, strangely, like the first honest thing I have said since arriving in this chamber. The doors at the far end of the room begin to close. Before they do, Counselor Dresch pauses at the threshold and looks back at me, her feathered crest raised slightly, an expression I cannot yet read. "You should know," she says quietly, her voice carrying just far enough to reach me, "that this council has ended entire alliances over less than what you just did." "Then I suppose we will find out what kind of alliance we are starting instead," I answer. She holds my gaze a moment longer, then turns and walks through the doors, which seal shut behind her with a soft, final sound. I am alone now, in a chamber built for 200 worlds, holding an unsigned treaty and a decision I cannot take back. Whatever happens next, I already know one thing for certain. Nothing about this negotiation is going to unfold the way anyone in this council expected. The recess does not last an hour. It lasts 3 days. I spend most of that time in a small guest chamber assigned to me near the outer ring of the council station, a round room with a low bed and a window that looks out onto a slow-moving field of stars. Meals arrive through a small hatch in the wall, prepared according to what the station scanners believe humans can safely eat. Most of it tastes like nothing in particular. I do not complain. I have bigger things to think about than the taste of my food. On the second day, a knock comes at my door. It is not the mechanical chime the station usually uses. It is an actual knock, careful and deliberate, 3 light taps. When the door slides open, Counselor Aura Dresch stands there, her feathered crest lowered in a way I am starting to recognize as a sign of caution rather than aggression. "May I come in?" she says, not quite a question. I step aside and let her enter. She looks around the small room, taking in the plain furniture, the narrow bed, the single chair by the window, and something about her expression softens, though I cannot say exactly what changes. "You live simply," she says. "I did not expect a long stay," I answer. She sits without being invited, lowering herself into the chair with a controlled grace that makes my own tired posture feel clumsy by comparison. For a moment she says nothing, watching me the way someone watches an animal they have not seen before, not with fear, but with careful curiosity. "I want to understand something," she finally says, "and I think you may be the only one willing to explain it to me honestly." "I'll try," I say, sitting on the edge of the bed across from her. "Why did you say no?" I consider the question longer than I probably need to. "Because signing that treaty would have hurt people who trusted us to protect them," I say. "It felt wrong. It still feels wrong. But you must have known the cost of refusing," she says. "You must have understood how this council operates. Every species that has ever sat at that table has learned to give a little to get a little. It is how 200 worlds avoid destroying each other. Compromise is not weakness here. It is survival." "I understand that," I say, "and I am not against compromise. If your council had come to us and said, 'Let's discuss a fair way to manage border tension,' I would have listened all day. But that is not what was offered. What was offered was, 'Give us your people's homes, and we will call it stability.'" Dresch is quiet again, her crest slowly rising and falling, as if breathing along with her thoughts. "You realize this puts your people in an unusual position. The council does not know how to categorize your response. Species that refuse outright are typically labeled uncooperative, sometimes even hostile. Fleets have been raised over less." Her words settle into the room like a weight. I feel my pulse quicken, but I try not to let it show in my voice. "Is that a warning?" "It is an explanation," she says. "I am not here to threaten you, Ambassador Whitfield. I am here because, frankly, I do not understand you, and I would prefer to understand before this goes any further." "Then let me try to explain something to you," I say. Humans do not measure risk the way most of your council seems to. We do not weigh comfort against principle and choose comfort every time. Sometimes we choose the harder path because giving in once means giving in forever. That sounds noble, Dresh says, not unkindly. It also sounds dangerous, for a species with your limited fleet numbers. Maybe, I admit, but I would rather be a small species with a spine than a large one that folds the moment someone applies pressure. Something flickers across her face, an expression I still cannot fully translate, somewhere between admiration and unease. You truly believe that? I do, I say, and so does everyone I have ever known back home. She studies me a while longer before rising from the chair. There is a session tomorrow, she says. The full council will reconvene. Speaker Van has requested that Earth send a different representative, someone he believes will be, in his words, more reasonable. My stomach tightens. What did our government say? Dresh's crest lifts slightly, an expression I now understand carries a trace of surprise. That is the part I came to tell you, she says. Your leadership responded within the hour. 4 words. She speaks for us. For a moment, I cannot speak at all. I think of Henry, sick and pale in a medical bay somewhere far from here, and I think of the officials back on Earth who barely know my name, who had every reason to replace me with someone more experienced, more polished, more prepared for a room like this council chamber, and instead they chose to stand behind me. They didn't ask for someone else, I say quietly, mostly to myself. No, Dresh says, they did not. I feel something steady settle in my chest, replacing some of the fear that has been sitting there since the recess began. It is not confidence exactly. It is something closer to purpose. I should tell you, Dresh continues, moving toward the door, not everyone in this council reacted to your government's response the way I did. Some see it as proof of unity. Others see it as proof of stubbornness. An entire species standing behind one decision without question. Speaker Van is among the second group. What do you think? I ask. She pauses at the threshold, considering the question carefully before answering. I think, she says slowly, that I have sat on this council for 11 cycles, and I have never once seen a species respond the way yours just did. That alone makes me want to keep watching. She leaves after that, the door sliding shut behind her, and I am left once again with the quiet hum of the station and the slow-turning field of stars outside my window. That night, sleep comes in fragments, broken by half-formed worries about tomorrow's session. I imagine the council chamber filled again, every seat occupied, every eye turned toward me, waiting to see whether the small, unprepared human who said no 3 days ago will crumble now that the shock has worn off. I decide, somewhere in those restless hours, that I will not crumble. The next morning, a council attendant arrives to escort me back to the chamber. The attendant is a quiet, insect-like being with several sets of delicate limbs, who says nothing during the walk but occasionally glances sideways at me, as if trying to determine what kind of creature would say no to the entire Galactic Council and still sleep soundly enough to attend the next session. When the chamber doors open, the room feels different than before. Fuller, somehow, though the same delegates occupy the same seats. I notice new faces scattered among the rows, observers from species who were not present during the first session, drawn here, I suspect, by word of what happened. Speaker Van waits at the central podium, his metallic skin catching the chamber's blue light. When he sees me enter, something in his posture tightens. Ambassador Whitfield, he says, his voice carrying clearly across the chamber. We trust the recess allowed you time to reconsider the council's proposal. It did, I say, taking my seat. My answer remains the same. A murmur spreads through the rows, quieter this time, more like something expected than something shocking. Word has clearly traveled. I see, Van says, though his tone suggests he does not, in fact, see at all. Then perhaps we should discuss why your government has chosen to support such an inflexible position rather than send a representative more suited to negotiation. I am suited to negotiation, I say. I am simply not suited to surrender. The distinction seems to frustrate him more than my earlier refusal did. There is a difference between negotiation and obstruction, Ambassador. This council functions because members are willing to bend. What you are describing is not principle, it is rigidity. With respect, Speaker Van, I say, keeping my voice level, I think what you are calling rigidity, my people would call keeping a promise. We promised those colonists protection when they settled those systems. I do not intend to break that promise because it would make your calculations easier. Van's expression shifts again, and for the first time, I see something beneath his composed exterior that looks almost like frustration, bordering on disbelief. He is not used to being told no twice. Councillor Dresch, seated nearby, watches the exchange with quiet interest, her crest neither raised nor lowered, simply still, as if she too is waiting to see how this unfolds. A new voice speaks up from farther back in the chamber, low and rumbling, belonging to a delegate I do not recognize, broad-shouldered and covered in dark-plated scales. If the humans refuse every term offered, what exactly is the purpose of continuing this session? The purpose, I answer before Van can respond, is to find terms that do not require sacrificing innocent people. I am not refusing every possible agreement. I am refusing this one. Then propose an alternative, the scaled delegate says, not unkindly, more like someone testing whether I actually have anything else to offer besides refusal. I take a breath, because this is the moment I have been quietly preparing for since the recess began. We propose a joint monitoring agreement, I say, shared oversight of the border sector, using sensors and personnel from multiple member species rather than removing the human colonies entirely. Stability without displacement. For a moment, nobody speaks. It is not the silence of shock this time, but the silence of consideration, dozens of minds turning the idea over at once. That is unconventional, Van says slowly. So is refusing your first offer, I say, and yet here we are. A quiet sound ripples through part of the chamber, something that might, in several different species, pass for laughter. Van does not look pleased, but he does not dismiss the proposal either. The council will need to review this alternative, he says finally. This session is recessed once more. As the chamber begins to empty, Dresch lingers near my seat, her crest lifted just slightly. That was well done, she says quietly. We'll see, I answer. They haven't agreed to anything yet. No, she says, but they are listening now instead of simply expecting you to fold. That is not nothing. I watch the delegates filing out, murmuring among themselves in dozens of overlapping languages, and I allow myself, just for a moment, to feel something close to hope. The treaty is not resolved, the tension has not disappeared, but for the first time since I arrived, I sense the shape of this negotiation shifting, moving away from a simple demand and towards something that might, eventually, resemble an actual conversation. Whatever happens next, I know one thing clearly now. Earth is behind me, fully and without hesitation, and that knowledge alone gives me the steadiness I need to keep standing in a room built for giants, refusing, quietly and firmly, to be moved. 5 days pass before the council calls me back, and in that time, the mood on the station changes in ways I can feel even without understanding every language spoken around me. Delegates who once nodded politely in the corridors now watch me with narrowed eyes or hurried glances, as if uncertain whether I am someone to greet or someone to avoid. When the summons finally comes, it arrives through a different attendant than before, a tall being with pale, almost translucent skin, who says only that the full council is convening for what he calls a review of position. His tone tells me this is not going to be a friendly conversation. The chamber, when I enter, feels heavier than either of my previous visits. Every seat is filled. Even the observation balconies above, usually reserved for minor dignitaries, are crowded with figures I do not recognize. Word of the human refusal has clearly traveled far beyond this room. Speaker Van stands at the podium, and beside him, projected in the air above the central floor, hovers a massive display of shifting lights and symbols. As I take my seat, the display sharpens into something I understand instantly, despite never having seen it rendered quite this way. It is a star map, our sector of space laid out in careful detail, dozens of points marked in a soft red glow. My stomach tightens as I recognize what those points represent. Human colonies, all of them, including ones I did not think the Council had detailed information about. Ambassador Whitfield, Van says, his voice carrying an edge of formal coldness I have not heard from him before. Before this Council continues discussing your proposed alternative, we feel it important that you fully understand the scale of what is at stake. He gestures, and the map expands further, additional lights appearing around the red points, this time in a pale silver color. Fleet markers, I realize, dozens of them, clustered near several of our border systems. These represent compact patrol vessels currently stationed within response range of your colonies. Van continues. I share this not as a threat, but as context. The galaxy is a large and complicated place, Ambassador. Stability requires careful management, and instability, once it begins, can be difficult to contain. The chamber is silent, every eye moving between the glowing map and me, waiting to see how I respond to this careful, deliberate display of scale. I look at the map a long moment before speaking, giving myself time to steady my breathing, to make certain my voice will come out even and clear. I understand the map, I say finally. I understand what those markers represent. I even understand why you felt it necessary to show them to me. Then you understand the risk of continued refusal, Van says. I understand the size of your fleet, I say. That is not the same thing as understanding risk, because you do not yet understand ours. A ripple moves through the chamber, quiet murmurs passing from seat to seat. Van's composed expression flickers, just slightly. Explain, he says. I take a breath, and when I speak again, I let myself say something I have thought carefully about since the last session. Something Henry once told me long before any of this began, back when he was still healthy enough to prepare me for meetings far smaller than this one. My species has a long history, I say, of facing situations where the other side held every visible advantage. Bigger numbers, better equipment, more resources, and time and again, the side with the bigger numbers assumed that advantage would be enough to force us to give up. It rarely was, not because we were stronger in the ways you can measure on a map, but because giving up was never actually on the table for us, no matter how the numbers looked. History is not a strategy, says a voice from the crowd, sharp and dismissive. I turn to see the scaled delegate from the previous session, arms crossed, clearly unconvinced. No, I agree, but it does tell you something about a people's character, and character, more than fleet numbers, is usually what decides how a standoff ends. Bold words, mutters a delegate seated near Van, his voice pitched just low enough that I suspect he meant it as an aside rather than a public statement, though the chamber's acoustics carry it clearly regardless. I suspect they are simply bluffing. The word lands in the chamber, like a stone dropped into still water. I feel dozens of eyes shift toward me, waiting. I turn toward the delegate who spoke, a slim figure with deep violet skin and sharp, angular features, his nameplate identifying him as a junior representative of the Tessic Compact. You're welcome to test that theory, I say, keeping my voice calm, almost gentle, but I would think carefully before you do. Bluffing is a strategy built on hoping the other side never calls your hand. We are not hoping for anything. We are simply telling you, plainly, what is true. There is a difference, and I think you already sense it, or you would not have needed to say that quietly, instead of directly to my face. The chamber falls into a silence, different from any I have felt here before, heavier, more uncertain. The junior delegate's angular features tighten, though he does not respond further. Van clears his throat, clearly attempting to steer the session back toward familiar territory. Ambassador Whitfield, no one here wishes for conflict. The display of fleet numbers was meant only to illustrate the seriousness of this situation, not to threaten your people. Then let's set it aside, I say, and return to the actual question in front of us. Is the council willing to consider the joint monitoring proposal, or is the only acceptable outcome one where my people lose their homes? Van hesitates, glancing briefly toward the other senior delegates seated near the front of the chamber. Councillor Dresch, I notice, gives the faintest nod, so small I almost miss it. The proposal has been reviewed, Van says finally, choosing his words with visible care. Several members of the council found aspects of it worth further discussion. Several, I repeat, not all. Change of this nature rarely comes easily, he says. Old habits do not disappear because one species refuses to follow them. No, I agree. But they do start to shift once enough people realize the old habit no longer works the way it used to. Something in his expression softens, just slightly, though whether from respect or simple exhaustion, I cannot tell. We will continue reviewing the proposal, he says. This session is adjourned. As the chamber begins to clear, I remain seated for a moment, watching the star map above the floor slowly fade from view, red points and silver markers dissolving back into empty air. My hands are trembling slightly, adrenaline finally catching up to me now that the pressure of the room has eased. Councillor Dresch approaches quietly, waiting until most of the other delegates have filed out before speaking. That was a considerable risk, she says, speaking to a Thessic representative that way, in open session. He called us bluffers, I say. I wasn't going to let that sit unanswered. Some would call that reckless, she says. Some would, I agree. I call it honest. She studies me for a long moment, her crest lifting slightly in that expression I now recognize as quiet respect. You realize, she says, that word of this session will spread even faster than the last. Other species are already asking questions about your people, wondering what exactly they are dealing with. Good, I say. Maybe it's time they found out. Dresch allows herself something close to a small, careful smile, the first I have seen from her. Get some rest, Ambassador Whitfield, she says. I suspect the coming days will require it. I nod, though as I rise from my seat and make my way out of the chamber, I already sense that rest will be difficult to find. The star map may have faded from the air above the chamber floor, but the image of those red points, our colonies, our people, remains fixed clearly in my mind, a reminder of exactly what I am fighting to protect, and exactly why I cannot afford to let this council forget it. Something changes after that session, though it takes me a few days to fully understand what it is. It starts small. A note slipped under my door late one evening, written in careful, formal standard script, unsigned, asking only whether the human delegation would be open to a private conversation with a smaller coalition of member worlds. I do not recognize the handwriting, if that is even the right word for the elegant, sweeping characters, but I recognize caution when I see it. Whoever wrote this did not want their name attached until they knew how I would respond. I send back a simple answer through the station's message system. Yes. The next morning, a delegation arrives at my quarters that I do not expect. 3 representatives, none of them from species I have interacted with directly before, each clearly nervous in their own particular way. One shifts constantly from foot to foot, or whatever the equivalent limb might be called for a being with 6 of them. Another keeps its 4 eyes lowered, rarely meeting mine directly. The third, a small round-bodied being covered in soft blue fur, speaks first, her voice gentle and hesitant. Ambassador Whitfield, she says, thank you for agreeing to meet with us. We represent the Volari Trade Concord, along with observers from the Kren Assembly and the Outer Ring Collective. Thank you for coming, I say, gesturing for them to sit around the small table in my quarters. What can I help you with? The 3 exchange a brief glance before the blue-furred representative continues. We wish to ask you something directly, without the formality of the full council chamber, she says. Something many of us have been discussing quietly since your first refusal. Go ahead, I say. What does your species actually want? She asks. The question catches me slightly off guard, not because it is unexpected, but because of how simply she asks it, as though the answer might genuinely be complicated in ways she cannot predict. We want to keep our promises to our own people, I say. We want fair treatment for member species, ourselves included. We are not trying to disrupt this council. We are trying to make certain it does not disrupt us. The six-limbed delegate speaks next, his voice a low, careful murmur. Forgive my confusion, Ambassador, but this council has functioned a particular way for longer than your species has known of its existence. Species join, they learn the patterns, they adjust their expectations accordingly. You have done neither. Maybe that's exactly the point, I say. Maybe the patterns were never actually fair. Maybe everyone simply assumed they had to accept them because no one had refused before. The four-eyed delegate lifts her gaze for the first time, studying me carefully. Our world joined this council 2 centuries ago, she says quietly. We seeded a border system very similar to what was asked of your people, under very similar justifications. We were told it was necessary for regional stability. What happened to that system, I ask. It was absorbed into Thessic administrative territory within a decade, she says. Our people who remained there were resettled. Most never returned to contact with our homeworld again. The room falls quiet for a long moment. I feel something settle heavily in my chest, a confirmation of exactly the fear that drove my refusal in the first place. I am sorry, I say quietly. We are not asking for your sympathy, Ambassador, the four-eyed delegate says. We are asking because we want to understand how you knew, without our history, without ever having lived through what we lived through, that this would be the outcome. I didn't know for certain, I admit. But it did not take much imagination to guess. Once you give something away because someone tells you it is necessary, there is very little stopping them from asking for the next thing, and the thing after that. The blue-furred representative nods slowly, her fur rippling gently with the motion. This is precisely what several of us have begun to discuss privately, she says. We are wondering, Ambassador Whitfield, whether our own governments made a mistake, many years ago, in accepting terms we should have questioned more carefully. That is not an easy thing to admit, I say. No, she agrees. It is not. But your refusal has made it difficult to avoid the question any longer. They stay for a while longer, asking careful questions about Earth, about our history, about the smaller conflicts and compromises that shaped how we approach disagreement. I answer as honestly as I can, careful not to embellish or exaggerate, letting the plain truth of our history speak for itself. By the time they leave, I sense something has shifted in the room, though I cannot yet tell exactly what it means for the larger council. Over the following days, more visits follow, some formal, most quiet and careful, delegates from a dozen different worlds seeking me out individually rather than through official channels. Some come with genuine curiosity, wanting to understand what makes humanity different. Others come with quiet confessions of their own histories, treaties signed under similar pressure, promises broken once compliance was secured. A few come simply to observe, saying very little, watching me the way one might watch weather patterns shifting on the horizon, trying to determine what is coming next. Councillor Dresch visits again near the end of that week, finding me in the small station garden reserved for delegates who need a quiet space to think. The garden is modest, a few dozen plants grown under carefully controlled light, but it is the closest thing to greenery available on this station, and I have found myself drawn here more often than I expected. You have become quite popular, Dresch says, settling onto the bench beside me. That's one word for it, I say. Speaker Van is not pleased, she continues. He had expected this matter to resolve quietly, one way or another, within a single cycle. Instead, half the council is now quietly reconsidering agreements they signed decades ago. That wasn't my intention, I say honestly. I only wanted to protect our own colonies. Intentions rarely limit consequences, Dresch says, not unkindly. You have shown this council something it has not had to consider in a very long time, that the old patterns are not the only patterns available, that refusal does not automatically mean collapse. Is that a bad thing? I ask. For some, yes, she says. For those who have built their power on the assumption that smaller worlds will always eventually comply, your example is deeply unwelcome. For others, she pauses, glancing toward the carefully tended plants around us. It is something closer to relief. "What happens now?" I ask. "The full council reconvenes in 3 days," she says. "Speaker Van intends to push for a final vote on the original treaty terms, hoping to settle the matter before more members follow the Valari example and begin questioning their own agreements." "And the joint monitoring proposal?" "Several delegations have expressed support," she says. "Enough, I believe, to make the outcome far less certain than Speaker Van would like." I feel a small, cautious flicker of hope at that, though I try not to let it grow too large too quickly. Nothing in this process has been simple so far, and I doubt the coming vote will be any different. "Why are you telling me all this?" I ask. "You're not exactly obligated to help me." Dresh considers the question for a long moment, her crest lifting and settling slowly, a motion I have come to associate with careful thought. "Because I have sat on this council for 11 cycles," she says finally, "watching smaller worlds fold, one after another, under pressure, dressed up as necessity. I have watched good people convince themselves that compliance was the only responsible choice. And I confess, Ambassador Whitfield, that some part of me has been waiting a very long time to see someone simply refuse." Her honesty catches me off guard, and for a moment neither of us speaks, the quiet hum of the garden's artificial light filling the space between us. "Thank you," I say eventually. "Do not thank me yet," she says, rising from the bench. "The vote has not happened, and Speaker Van is not a being who accepts losing gracefully." She leaves me there among the carefully tended plants, and I sit a while longer, watching the artificial light shift slowly overhead, thinking about everything that has happened since that first tense session in the council chamber. What began as a simple refusal has become something far larger than I anticipated, a question spreading quietly through this ancient institution, unsettling assumptions that have stood unchallenged for longer than my species has existed among the stars. I do not know yet how the coming vote will resolve, but I know, sitting here, that whatever happens, the shape of this council has already begun to change, and there will be no simple way to return it to what it was before I sat down in that chamber and said the one word nobody expected to hear. The morning of the final vote arrives quietly, without fanfare, though I have not slept well in days. I stand outside the council chamber doors for a long moment before they open, going over everything I have learned since I first sat down in that overwhelming room. The mining families, waiting for word of their future. The Valari representative who admitted her own world's mistake. Councillor Dresh's quiet confession in the garden. Henry, still recovering somewhere far from here, sending me a short message every day simply asking whether I was holding steady. I always answered the same way, still here. When the doors slide open, the chamber feels different than it has on any previous occasion. Fuller, yes, every seat and balcony packed with delegates and observers, but also charged with something harder to name, a kind of anticipation that seems to hum beneath the surface of every conversation happening in low voices around the room. I take my seat at the human station, and almost immediately I notice something new. Several delegations that had previously kept their distance now offer small, deliberate nods as I pass, gestures of acknowledgement I have not received before. The Valari representative catches my eye briefly and inclines her head. The four-eyed delegate from the Kren Assembly does the same. Small signs, but I notice them. Speaker Van stands at the central podium, his metallic skin catching the chamber's blue light exactly as it did during our first meeting, though something in his posture seems less certain than before. Beside him, the same star map from days earlier hovers in the air, red and silver lights marking colonies and fleets, though this time, I notice, several delegates seated nearby barely glance at it. "This council convenes," Van announces, his voice carrying across the chamber, "to determine the final status of the treaty terms proposed regarding the border systems in question. 2 paths have been presented, the original terms, requiring relocation of human colonies for the sake of regional stability, and an alternative, proposed by Ambassador Whitfield, establishing joint oversight without displacement." He pauses, glancing briefly toward me before continuing. The council will now vote. I feel my heart pounding steadily in my chest as the voting begins, delegation after delegation registering their choice through small illuminated markers on their stations, the results displayed as shifting light along the chamber's outer wall. I watch as the Thessic Compact and several of its closest allies vote in favor of the original terms, exactly as expected. But then, slowly, other lights begin appearing, in favor of the alternative. The Volari Trade Concord, the Kren Assembly, the Outer Ring Collective. One by one, delegations that visited me quietly over the past week register their support, their choices no longer hidden behind careful, unsigned notes slipped under my door, but declared openly, in front of the entire council. More lights follow, delegations I never spoke with directly, worlds I know almost nothing about, each adding their support to the growing tally. I watch Councillor Dresch's own marker illuminate among them, her choice made plainly, without hesitation. When the final tally settles, the chamber falls into a stillness unlike anything I have felt here before. The alternative proposal has passed, not by an overwhelming margin, but by enough to matter, enough to change the outcome entirely. Speaker Van stands motionless for a long moment, staring at the results glowing along the chamber wall before finally turning back toward the room. "The council has decided," he says, his voice noticeably quieter than before. "The joint monitoring proposal is adopted. The original relocation terms are withdrawn." A wave of sound moves through the chamber, not quite applause, since so many of these species express approval in ways entirely unfamiliar to me, but something clearly resembling it, a rustle of limbs and wings, and unfamiliar gestures rippling across the rows. I sit very still for a moment, letting the reality of it settle over me. The mining families will keep their homes. The two small colonies will remain exactly where they are. Nothing has been given away. Nothing sacrificed for the sake of someone else's convenience. Van turns toward me once the chamber quiets, his expression difficult to read, somewhere between frustration and something that might be grudging respect. "You have created quite a disruption, Ambassador Whitfield," he says. "I only refused one unfair treaty," I say. "I did not ask anyone else to reconsider theirs." "No," he admits. "But it seems your refusal reminded several members of this council that reconsideration was always an option, even if it had not felt that way for a very long time." I do not know quite how to respond to that, so I simply nod, and Van, after a moment, offers something close to a small, formal bow, an acknowledgement I suspect does not come easily to him. The session ends not long after, delegates rising slowly from their seats, murmuring among themselves as they file out of the chamber. Several pause near the human station on their way out, offering brief words of acknowledgement, small gestures of respect I am only beginning to understand across so many different cultures. Councillor Dresch remains behind after most of the chamber has emptied, waiting near my seat until the last of the observers have filed out. "You did something today that this council has needed for a long time," she says quietly. "I only wanted to protect our colonies," I say again, because it feels important to keep saying it, to remind myself that this was never about anything grander than that simple goal. "Perhaps," she says, "but protecting your own people, in this particular way, at this particular moment, has done something much larger than you intended. Several delegations have already requested formal review of past agreements made under similar pressure. Speaker Van's influence, I suspect, will weaken considerably in the coming cycles." "I did not set out to weaken anyone," I say. "No," she agrees, "but sometimes the simple act of standing firm reveals just how much of the surrounding structure depended on everyone else being willing to bend." I consider her words as we walk together out of the chamber, through corridors that feel less imposing now than they did on my first day here, though nothing about the station itself has changed. Only my understanding of it has shifted, reshaped by everything that has happened since I first sat down at that table with an unsigned treaty in front of me. "What happens to you now?" Dresch asks, as we reach the section of the station where our paths will separate. "I go home," I say. "Report back to Earth. Let people who actually know what they're doing handle whatever comes next in this relationship with the council. You handled quite a lot yourself, she says. I had help, I say, thinking of Henry's daily messages, of Earth's simple, unwavering four-word reply, of every quiet conversation that built toward today's vote. I wasn't really doing this alone, even when it felt that way. Dresch studies me a moment longer, her feathered crest lifting slightly. For what it is worth, Ambassador Whitfield, I believe this council is better for having been forced to listen to you. Whatever discomfort that caused certain members, myself included at times, I suspect we needed it. Thank you, I say, and I mean it more than the simple words probably convey. She offers a small nod before continuing down her own corridor, and I stand there a moment longer, watching her go, before making my own way toward the transport bay, where a shuttle waits to carry me back toward Earth. The journey home takes several days, plenty of time to sit with everything that happened, to replay each session in my mind, wondering at several points whether I made the right choices, whether some quieter, more diplomatic version of myself might have achieved the same outcome without so much tension along the way. But each time I consider it, I return to the same conclusion. The families in those colonies did not need a quieter version of me. They needed someone who would say the one true thing, clearly and without wavering, even when an entire room full of powerful strangers expected otherwise. When the shuttle finally descends toward Earth, I find Henry waiting at the landing platform, thinner than I remember, but steady on his feet, a small, tired smile on his face as I step down from the ramp. I heard, he says simply, before I can even offer a greeting. All of it. The council session recordings reached us 3 days ago. I hope I didn't embarrass anyone, I say. He laughs, a short, warm sound I have missed more than I realized. Claire, you didn't embarrass us. You reminded an entire galaxy what it looks like when someone actually means what they say. I do not have a clever response to that, so I simply let myself smile, tired and relieved, standing on solid ground for the first time in what feels like a very long while. In the weeks that follow, reports filter back from the council station, carried through official channels and quiet, unofficial ones alike. Several member worlds have indeed opened formal reviews of older agreements, exactly as Dresch predicted. Speaker Van's standing among the senior delegates has weakened, replaced gradually by voices more open to genuine negotiation rather than simple compliance. The Valari Trade Concord has begun quiet talks regarding the border system they lost 2 centuries earlier, though no one expects that particular matter to resolve quickly or easily. And on the Council's growing list of matters requiring future discussion, a new item appears, one that did not exist before my first session in that chamber. A simple line, added almost as an afterthought to the agenda, but carrying weight that will likely shape Council proceedings for cycles to come. Guidelines for negotiation with member species unwilling to compromise on matters of fundamental principle. I read that line more than once when it reaches me, sitting quietly in my small office back on Earth, surrounded by the ordinary comforts of home I once took entirely for granted. It occurs to me, reading it, that an entire galaxy of ancient, powerful civilizations has just been forced to consider something they apparently never needed to consider before. That not every disagreement ends in compromise. That sometimes a species simply means what it says, and stands by it, regardless of how the numbers on any star map might look. I think of the mining families, still living safely in their small colony, still calling that cold rocky moon home exactly as they always have. I think of the 2 smaller colonies nearby, unchanged, unmoved, exactly where they were meant to remain, and I think finally of that single word I spoke in a chamber built for 200 worlds, a word that felt so small in the moment, yet somehow reshaped the way an entire council understood what it meant to negotiate with humanity. No. It was never meant to be complicated. It was never meant to start a movement, or unsettle ancient alliances, or place my name into records that will likely be studied by future diplomats long after I am gone. It was only ever meant to protect people who trusted us to keep our word. But sometimes, I am learning, the simplest truths carry the furthest, echoing quietly through even the grandest, oldest halls of power, until eventually someone finally stops to listen.